In 1914, Europe was ruled by a handful of aging titans. Looking at this map, the geopolitical landscape was dominated by four massive empires: the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman. Together, they controlled almost the entire continent, casting long shadows over the smaller independent nations. At the top of these regimes, politics was literally a family business. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, seen here in his traditional, highly ornate military attire, commanded one of the most lethal armies on Earth. Yet across the border, his direct rival was Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. They were blood cousins, sharing deep family ties and an aristocratic aesthetic that belonged to a bygone era of kings and emperors. Their military thinking was equally stuck in the past. Generals still romanticized the idea of glorious cavalry charges, planning to send men on horseback into battle, wearing bright, theatrical uniforms. Their leaders had spent decades stockpiling highly efficient, industrial-scale weapons, yet they planned for a polite 19th-century war. This disconnect between imperial arrogance and the reality of modern firepower created a blind spot that would swallow millions of lives. The collapse of this fragile system began with a navigational error. On a summer morning in Sarajevo, a driver missed his route and stalled his car while trying to turn around in a narrow street. In the back seat of that stalled vehicle was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. Standing just a few feet away was a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip. He belonged to a radical group demanding independence for his people, representing the fierce nationalism boiling underneath the surface of these massive empires. Then Princip drew a pistol and fired. Austria-Hungary immediately issued an impossible ultimatum to Serbia, demanding complete submission. When Serbia hesitated, a complex continent-wide web of defense alliances triggered automatically. Germany backed Austria, Russia backed Serbia, France and Britain were pulled in. The system designed to deter war had just guaranteed it. Even as armies mobilized, the leadership remained dangerously naive. Soldiers marched out in parade formations alongside cheering civilians, assured by the Kaiser that they would be home before the leaves fall. The geopolitical fail-safe alliance system had been marketed as a way to prevent war through deterrence. Instead, it ensured that a minor regional dispute would pull every corner of the globe into the conflict. Germany's Schlieffen Plan relied entirely on speed. Their objective, a massive sweep of troops through neutral Belgium to capture Terrace in 40 days. But pushing too fast, their lines fractured, opening a 50-kilometer void right in their advancing army. French commanders spotted the vulnerability and scrambled every available man to the front lines, even requisitioning hundreds of civilian taxicabs from the streets of Paris to transport soldiers. They hit the gap and forced the Germans to retreat. The rapid offensive completely stalled. To hold their ground, soldiers on both sides began digging into the earth. Within months, a continuous, fortified scar of trenches stretched all the way from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The romantic fantasy of a quick, heroic victory died in the freezing mud. Men found themselves trapped in filthy, rat-infested ditches, surviving through harsh winters while enduring constant artillery fire. Modern industrial weapons made defensive positions completely impenetrable. Millions of men were now trapped in a brutal, multi-year stalemate that no general knew how to break. While the West was completely frozen in mud, the Eastern Front showcased the terrifying mobility of modern warfare. Here, the sheer scale of the landscape required a new kind of battlefield coordination. During the Battle of Tannenberg, Russian commanders made a fatal error. Lacking proper codes, they broadcast their troop movements over unencrypted radio channels, speaking plainly right into the ears of German intelligence. Armed with exactly where the Russians were heading, the Germans weaponized their advanced railway network. They loaded their soldiers onto steam trains, rapidly repositioning massive armies across the countryside in a matter of days. The Russian Second Army marched straight into a trap. Completely outmaneuvered, they were surrounded and annihilated, losing over 100,000 men in a single engagement. By combining intercepted radio signals with high-speed rail transport, the German command turned war into a logistical operation. Victory was now a product of industrial efficiency, creating a factory line for mass slaughter. Unable to break the gridlock in Europe, desperate empires dragged their global colonies into the meat grinder, searching for any advantage to tip the scales. Because Britain controlled a quarter of the globe, they deployed over 1.5 million Indian soldiers, sending them to fight and die in foreign trenches far from home. Entirely new fronts were opened in a bid to flank the enemy. British and Anzac forces launched a massive amphibious invasion on the rocky shores of Gallipoli, hoping to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the fight. But the Ottomans, fighting for the literal survival of their homeland, dug their own trenches on the high ground and repelled the invasion, inflicting hundreds of thousands of casualties. Back in Europe, the violence reached its peak at Verdun. Millions of artillery shells were fired over 10 months, literally reshaping the geography and turning the Earth into a charred, desolate moonscape. The conflict had moved beyond capturing territory. It was now a mathematical war of attrition, designed simply to bleed the enemy's population dry until they could no longer sustain the effort. By the time the guns finally fell silent after 4 years, 20 million people were dead. The survivors looked out over a continent in ashes, ruined by economic collapse. The old world was wiped off the map. Look at the borders of 1914. The Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires, the very regimes that eagerly started the fight, were entirely destroyed. In their wake, the map of the world was violently redrawn, carving a complex patchwork of new, volatile countries out of Europe and the Middle East. The domestic structures of power shattered along with the borders. The elite aristocracies lost their wealth and influence, and the sheer fatigue of war triggered the Russian Revolution, birthing the Soviet Union. With millions of men at the front, women moved into the munitions factories to sustain the war effort. Operating heavy machinery like this provided the economic leverage that finally forced governments to grant women voting rights across much of the West. The war acted as a giant wrecking ball, systematically dismantling the monarchies, social hierarchies, and imperial structures that had confidently marched the world into the abyss. Hostilities officially ended on November 11, 1918, but the peace that followed was a vindictive mirage. The victors forced humiliating treaties upon the defeated. Inside the opulent Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, Germany was stripped of its territory, forced to disarm, and buried under crippling financial debt. These agreements punished the losers but ignored the underlying systemic diseases. The extreme nationalism and imperial greed that sparked the conflict were left completely untreated. By bankrupting nations and dividing ethnic groups across artificial borders, the treaties planted the seeds of economic resentment and political extremism that would later fuel World War II. The Great War didn't just end the archaic era of empires. It violently birthed the chaotic, conflict-ridden modern world we live in today.